American fleet has been stationed close to Venezuela in the largest US military buildup in the Western Hemisphere in decades. Thousands of soldiers are now positioned across Puerto Rico, American advanced fighter jets are now doing missions in the Caribbean Sea, while a massive naval fleet is waiting for a command close to the coast of Venezuela. In response to American actions, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro mobilized thousands of his own soldiers to prepare for a potential invasion and defend his grip on power. All of this is happening because for over 2 decades, Venezuela has positioned itself as the leader of resistance to US influence in Latin America and built partnerships with Russia and China to protect itself. Under Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela has nationalized American companies, facilitated drug trafficking to the United States, and threatened to invade neighboring Guyana, where US energy companies have invested billions of dollars to extract oil. What began as an ideological disagreement has now become a direct threat to American power in Latin America, and the massive military forces gathering near Venezuela suggest that something big is about to happen. The Trump administration justifies this deployment as part of operations against drug trafficking in the region. The US recently carried out strikes on vessels at sea that it claimed were transporting drugs from Venezuela. Following the strikes, Trump said that there would be serious consequences for anyone attempting to bring drugs into the United States. In response to American actions, Venezuelan fighter jets conducted flyovers over the American ships. It was designed to interfere with American operations in the region, but such a confrontation also increases the risk of a military incident that could escalate into something bigger. But to understand why tensions have reached this point, we need to look back at why this standoff began in the first place. Historically, Venezuela was one of America's key partners in Latin America, benefiting enormously from American investment in its oil industry and maintaining strong democratic institutions, while many other countries in the region suffered under military dictatorships. Venezuela enjoyed economic prosperity through its partnership with American oil companies and remained a stable democracy when much of Latin America was in turmoil. However, some Venezuelan politicians began to criticize American foreign policy in the region, particularly interventions in Chile and Central America, while maintaining profitable relationships with Cuba despite the US embargo. This created a tradition of selective opposition to American policies that would later be exploited when Hugo Chavez came to power as Venezuela's president in 1999. Chavez rejected the American economic model and embraced what he called the 21st century socialism that challenged American influence over Latin America. Under Chavez and later his successor Maduro, Venezuela transformed from a reliable American partner into the leader of resistance to US influence in the region, inspiring other left-leaning governments across the continent. For Washington, Venezuela now represents a dangerous example, as it refuses to cooperate with the United States and actively works to undermine US influence in Latin America. But Venezuela's challenge to American interests goes beyond just ideology. At the heart of this conflict lies Venezuela's massive oil wealth. The country has over 300 billion barrels of oil reserves, which is more than even Saudi Arabia has. Under Chavez, the Venezuelan government nationalized American oil companies, seizing billions in American investments without proper compensation. Washington viewed this as a theft of American property, creating lasting anger in corporate America and among policymakers, who had expected Venezuela to remain a reliable energy partner. Since 2019, US sanctions have targeted Venezuela's oil sector, trying to cut off Maduro's government from revenue while keeping this vast oil wealth locked away from global markets. For the Maduro regime, controlling these oil resources isn't just about economics, it's about political survival. That is why for Maduro and his inner circle, the American naval deployment represents a direct threat to their hold on power. The government has used the external threat to rally domestic support and justify emergency measures that strengthen its control, with state media constantly warning about American invasion plans while organizing civilian militias to defend the country. Maduro's political survival depends entirely on maintaining his image as Venezuela's defender against foreign aggression, and any sign of weakness or compromise with Washington would undermine his rule. and could trigger his downfall among his supporters. But the regime's grip on power depends on more than just revolutionary speeches. For a long time, the Maduro government has operated as what US intelligence calls a narco-state, where top officials profit directly from drug trafficking and other criminal activities. According to American authorities, Maduro himself and his inner circle are involved in cocaine trafficking, with Venezuelan generals controlling smuggling routes through the Caribbean. Beyond drugs, the regime profits from oil revenues, gold mining, currency manipulation, and human trafficking networks. For these actors, losing power means not just political defeat, but potential arrest and extradition to face the American justice system, a fate that makes them willing to fight to the end. This criminal behavior, however, is just one part of Venezuela's broader challenge to American interests in the region. Venezuela's recent threats against neighboring Guyana have added new urgency to US concerns about regional stability and American energy investments. In late 2023, Maduro's government held a referendum claiming the right to take over Guyana's oil-rich territory, which contains vast offshore oil reserves currently being developed by American companies. This dispute involves roughly 2/3 of Guyana's territory and virtually all of its oil resources, with Venezuelan military exercises near the border raising fears of invasion. For the Trump administration, protecting Guyana means safeguarding billions in American energy investments and preventing Venezuela from potentially doubling its oil reserves through conquest. But Venezuela's regional influence extends beyond territorial threats. For a long time, Venezuela served as an economic lifeline that helped keep Cuba's communist government afloat, providing subsidized oil and financial support that have been crucial for Cuba's survival. This partnership allows Cuba to maintain its anti-American stance just 90 miles from Florida, while providing Venezuela with crucial intelligence and security expertise. Cuban advisors helped train Venezuelan security forces, while sharing surveillance and intelligence capabilities developed over decades of authoritarian rule. Some American political elites believe that breaking this alliance is essential to rolling back left-wing influence across the Caribbean region and potentially forcing regime change in both countries at the same time. The Cuba-Venezuela partnership, however, is part of an even larger challenge to American dominance in the region. Beyond this partnership, Venezuela has also become the primary entry point for Chinese and Russian influence in Latin America, providing America's strategic rivals with a crucial foothold in the Western Hemisphere. China has invested over $60 billion in Venezuelan infrastructure and energy projects, while Russia has deployed military advisors and provided advanced weapons systems. Russian companies also control significant portions of Venezuela's oil sector, while Chinese firms have built telecommunications networks and surveillance systems that extend Beijing's technological reach across the region. These partnerships allow both China and Russia to project power directly into America's traditional area of influence, establishing military cooperation and intelligence sharing agreements that represent a fundamental challenge to US regional dominance. This growing threat helps explain why the Trump administration's approach to Venezuela has become increasingly aggressive. During his first presidency, Trump already pursued an aggressive strategy to remove Maduro from power. The administration imposed major economic sanctions, recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president, and increased pressure through various means. At the same time, the failed invasion attempt in 2020 by American mercenaries exposed the extent of covert efforts to topple Maduro's government. However, rather than weakening the regime, the failed invasion only strengthened Maduro's grip on power and intensified anti-American sentiment. But more importantly, the failure of regime change efforts during Trump's first term has now paved the way for a more direct military confrontation during his return to the presidency. And Trump's choice of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor signals exactly that kind of escalation. The Cuban-American senator has spent decades opposing left-leaning governments in Latin America and has been one of the harshest critics of the Maduro regime. Throughout his Senate career, Rubio has consistently supported maximum pressure tactics against Venezuela and opposed efforts to engage diplomatically with Maduro's government. His appointment shows that the Trump administration sees Venezuela as one of the main foreign policy priorities, with all options remaining on the table if current pressure tactics fail. But Venezuela is just one piece of Trump's broader strategy to reassert American dominance across the Western Hemisphere. The administration has simultaneously demanded that Panama renegotiate control control of the Panama Canal to favor US companies, threatened direct military action against Mexican drug cartels, and proposed mass deportations that would send migrants to Central American countries like El Salvador. These policies reflect a return to old-style American power projection, where military and economic pressure are used to reshape Latin American politics according to Washington's preferences. Venezuela serves as the primary test case for this renewed approach. The question now is whether Trump will actually follow through on his threats. We could be certain that any potential US military action against Venezuela would leverage America's significant technological and firepower advantages. However, such an operation would carry enormous risks for the United States. History shows how quickly military interventions can turn into costly disasters. After all, the failed invasion of Cuba in 1961 became an international embarrassment for the United States, while more recent interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated how initial military success can lead to a prolonged and expensive fight that achieves limited results. Even Russia, with its supposed military advantages, has suffered over 1 million casualties in Ukraine, while controlling less territory than it did in 2022, proving that a modern invasion could quickly turn into a disaster. A potential naval invasion of Venezuela would face similar challenges. Even worse, any invasion could trigger a regional conflict, with Venezuela's neighbors potentially retaliating against American interests throughout Latin America, turning what appears to be a limited operation into a multi-front crisis that could drag on for years. The key to containing such escalation lies with Brazil and Colombia, both of which are currently led by left-leaning presidents deeply skeptical of US intervention. To this day, Brazilian President Lula and Colombian President Petro have maintained diplomatic engagement with Venezuela despite international pressure to isolate the Maduro government. If these regional powers condemn potential American military actions and rally other Latin American countries against US intervention, they could leave the United States completely isolated in its own hemisphere, undermining American influence across the region for decades to come. That is why the current Venezuelan crisis represents a defining moment for Trump's foreign policy and America's future role in Latin America. The outcome could have major implications that extend far beyond the Caribbean region. Success in removing Maduro could encourage the US to take similar approaches elsewhere in South America, while failure could accelerate the decline of US influence in the Western Hemisphere, potentially encouraging more countries to strengthen ties with China and others. The warships currently near Venezuelan waters represent more than military positioning. They embody the fundamental question of whether America can still project decisive power in its traditional sphere of influence, or whether Latin America has already become a region where multiple powers compete on equal terms. The answer may well determine whether America remains the dominant force in its own backyard, or becomes just another player competing for influence.